When Herbert Nigel Gresley took up office as the Locomotive Superintendent for the Great Northern Railway in 1911, that railway was experiencing rapid growth. No sooner had Henry Ivatt, Gresley's predecessor, introduced his own 422 Express locomotive class A2, did the Great Northern require even larger locomotives in the form of the 442 Atlantics. Gresley's first original design was not an express locomotive though. It was a humble 264 goods engine, as per requirements of the running department. In fact, most of Gresley's designs for the Great Northern would be freight locomotives. A major part of the success of Gresley's large locomotives was their cylinder arrangement. With 3 cylinders, one between the frames, they were kinder to the track due to lessened hammer blow, caused by the heavy end of the wheel thrashing down as the locomotive runs hard. Gresley had always kept a keen eye on the technological advancements of other railways. Of particular interest to him were the 4-cylindered Great Western Railway 460s, and the Pennsylvania Railroad's K-Class 462 Pacifics. When the Great War raged, Gresley realised the Ivatt Atlantics were probably in need of supplementing on the heaviest express runs sooner rather than later. A 4-cylindered 460, very much aping the Great Western, was considered at first, but a 460 would abandon the greatest benefit the Ivatt Atlantics had over other express designs: their wide fireboxes. A wider firebox means more steam raising ability, so instead they added a carrying truck beneath the firebox to keep the 6-driven wheels but maintain the greater steaming, so the design went on to be a 462. To test the feasibility of the 4-cylinder arrangement, Gresley sought to do rebuilding of Atlantic number 279 in 1915. When rebuilt, this locomotive had the same cylinder dimensions and valve layout as the proposed Pacific. The idea was to build the new Pacific with dimensions similar to those of the large Atlantics. Driving wheels were 6 foot 8 inch and the bogie wheels were 3 foot 2 inch, taken from Gresley's Class H 260 Moguls. The boiler was to be the same as on the large Atlantics, like on number 279, 5 foot 6 inch in diameter, but with the length of the barrel increased to 20 foot. The smoke box per this diagram is thus larger than it seems on the outside. As per standard on the Great Northern Railway, the locomotive would have had ram's bottom safety valves and a cab devoid of side windows, which give the look of an elongated Class C1. Sadly, performance on number 279 was no more remarkable than on a standard 2-cylinder Atlantic, so hopes that a 462 version of the design was to be an exemplary locomotive were dashed. And that is where the idea for the 1915 Great Northern Railway Pacific was abandoned. With Gresley having upgraded the Atlantics during the war, and with the newfound experience gained from souping up the Atlantics to the degree of number 279, a realisation must have been had. Ivatt practice was not to be the future. The problem was the only Pacific tender locomotive to run in Britain had been the Great Western Railway's number 111, the Great Bear, a locomotive which suffered from the length of its boiler. So, no good observing British practice then. But over in the United States had appeared the locomotive which solved virtually every problem Gresley had with British engineering: the Pennsylvania Railroad's K4. The PRR's fourth development of a Pacific locomotive, the K4 was the locomotive to consolidate dimensions and cylinder capacity. Indeed, when a new design was proposed in 1916, picking up from where the 4-cylinder Pacific version of the large Atlantic had left off, it was more or less just a K4 resized for the Great Northern Railway's loading gauge. The technological success of the new locomotive was immediately evident. It was enormous. The tender was a completely new design, 8-wheeled and taller than the standard GNR design. The cab was unlike any other GNR locomotives, looking far more like what you'd find on the harsher Northeastern railway routes. And the boiler followed PRR practice, in that it was fitted with a combustion chamber and it tapered up from the firebox before dipping back down towards the cylindrical smokebox. It was this very tapering which evidently caused quite a stir for the GNR publicity department. For when the new locomotive Class A1 was photographed for a poster or a pamphlet, it was not unknown for the photograph to be doctored showing the locomotive having a parallel boiler. The paralleling had been the norm for the Great Northern Railway. Not even the proposed C1 Pacific would have had a conical boiler. 2 A1s would be built for the Great Northern, both in 1922, with the pair rigorously tested to ensure this venture was to be a fruitful one. Beyond York, the Northeastern Railway was also trialling a new class of Pacific, Vincent Raven's Class 462. Yes, that's actually the classification of the locomotive. The interesting thing there is that the LNER Class 462 was in reality just a lengthened Atlantic. Take a Raven Class Z of 1912, increase the parallel boiler to 6 feet in diameter, lengthen it to 26 feet, increase the cylinders to 19 inches bore, and bolt a huge wide firebox at the end of it. They were not to work in tandem with the Great Northern Railway A1's hauling trains from York to Berwick or Edinburgh, and so differed significantly from the Gresley offering. For instance, the Raven loco had cylinders cast in a monoblock. This means all 3 cylinders were the same part. If one fails, you need to throw out the other 2 along with it. Though oddly enough, they had more in common with the Great Western Railway's Great Bear. The trailing axle below the cab was a radial design, whereas Gresley had used a Cartazzi wheelset for his specifics. The problem here was, much like with the Great Bear, that the bearings were situated directly behind the firebox. So, as the 2 Class 462s would run, the bearings got hotter and hotter from both friction and the heat of 2,875 square foot worth of a roaring fire right in front of it. The bearings would melt, or otherwise seize up the axle, a problem which would lead to the further authorised members of the 462 class to be built with the Great Northern Railway's Cartazzi arrangement. Hot axle bearings was not all the 462s struggled with. Their coal combustion was excellent, better than the Gresley A1, but they used up a lot more fuel per mile, even if they could maintain the same performance with heavier trains than an A1. The 462s were so long, they wrecked themselves on tight bends and were known to have hit curved platforms. Indeed, the class were never top-link locomotives, being stabled at Gateshead for the heaviest secondary duties when they were introduced. Their time to shine would come, but well after the Great Northern and Northeastern Railways merged into the London and Northeastern Railway in 1923. Perhaps their story is one for another dedicated video. Still in 1922, on the GNR, numbers 1470 and 1471 had proved themselves by travelling the 106 miles between London and Grantham, on a constant climb mind you, in 122 minutes. They were not perfect. They proved hungry machines, their short travel valves held them back, and their boiler pressure was deliberately gimped at 180 psi. But nonetheless, they were a significant improvement over the C1s. So much so that in 1922, 10 more A1s were ordered by the Great Northern Railway, numbers 1472 to 1481. But that is another story, told better by other writers. A story which would ultimately end up in record-breaking locomotives, built like watches. So perhaps we ought to allow Nigel Gresley the one misstep. Or 2. Or 3. I'm ruining my own argument again, aren't I?